A few days ago, the UK government announced a £1.57 billion package to support theatres and music venues, as well as art galleries and other cultural institutions. Through our speakers today, we have an opportunity to show how safety and health professionals can enable this industry to restart and recover. With the right health and safety measures in place, the events sector can be a powerful vehicle to drive recovery. First, we have Andrew Böber, Head of Health and Safety at the All England Lawn Tennis Club. Andrew has worked at several international well-known institutions, including the Globe Theatre, the Royal Opera House, and in his present role with the All England Lawn Tennis Club, and is a chartered safety and health professional. Andrew will be followed by Nick Dugdale-Moore, Regional Manager of the Global Association of the Exhibition Industry, where Nick will take us through the UFI framework for reopening exhibitions and business events. Nick is responsible for UFI's more than 300 members in Europe, organising the annual UFI European Conference and promoting and presenting the European exhibition industry internationally. Next, we have Simon Garrett, Director of X-Venture Global Risk Solutions, a Chartered Fellow of IOSH and Vice Chair of the IOSH Sports Ground and Events Committee. Simon was the former Operations Director of Earls Court, and he has worked with most of the major UK-based global organisers in the UK, Europe, Africa, Asia and the Americas. And finally, Chris Skeeth is the Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Event Organisers, which is the leading association for organisers of events in the UK and internationally. Chris holds a seat on the UK Government's Events Industry Board Committee and is Vice Chair and Treasurer of Business Visits and Events Partnership, a partnership of all leading associations in the event industry, representing the sector to government and to regulators. He is a UFI board member and chair of their associations. Our speakers provide us with tremendous knowledge and experience. Questions and answers will be handled at the end by our panel presenters, so please do take this opportunity to submit them throughout the webinar and we will address as many as we can. I want to emphasise that this and our other webinars are a platform to inform and engage with safety and health professionals and others responsible for safety and health at work. We want to support you with this regular platform for engagement, a two-way channel giving you an opportunity to share support and guidance on this evolving issues wherever you are and in any sector. Now, more than ever, organisations need authoritative, useful, relevant advice and guidance on managing the safety and health of their workforces. Please do visit IOSH's website, especially www.iosh.com/returning safely for continually updated COVID-19 advice and guidance. Now, a member of the IOSH team is taking care of the technical aspects today to make sure that everything runs smoothly, but please do bear in mind that we're connecting people from across the world. Just a few points on housekeeping before we begin. All attendees are muted. On your toolbar, you will notice a small bar with a chat and a Q&A option. If you have a technical issue or audio problem, then please do message us using the chat option. If you have any questions for the presenters relating to the content of the session, please post them in the Q&A option. We will refer to the questions you've posted throughout the session after the speakers have completed their presentations. Now, we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to ask the speakers to please keep to their allotted time. And finally, just so you're aware, today's session is being recorded for future playback and sharing. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker, who is Andrew Böber from the All England Tennis Club. So Andrew, over to you. Please share your screen.
Brilliant. So this is just to kind of kickstart things for everyone. It's to give you a critical insight to our thinking really around how COVID-19 has affected us and how it's and how it's consequently impacted on terms of our planning thinking. It's probably worth setting the scene here is whilst we're delivering a major tennis tournament, we are also a private members club. I've also got a golf club, I've got a community sports grounds. We've still had major construction works continuing throughout this period under CLC guidelines. I've got staff working within grounds throughout the stage of the pandemic because we have to maintain the critical services within the grounds. We've also for several weeks now been operating one of the kitchens which has been producing 200 hot meals a day for neighbouring boroughs of Merton and Wandsworth. You would have seen on TV that we've got a broadcast element that's been going on for the last couple of weeks, which is content filling over what would have been the championship. So we are practically learning as well as implementing during this period, aligning within planning. What it's really done is it's taking us right back to the drawing board. So what we know in respect to the impacts, and much of this is stuff that all the participants who have joined in will understand. COVID, there is no vaccine, and social distancing is considered the most effective control in reducing its spread. It's because of that that effectively the event industry has evaporated throughout 2020. It's important to know that beyond the financial impact of the industry, there remains this strong desire for this social enrichment which events bring. Cancellation has forced us to go back to the drawing board and reassess everything. Now, this is kind of leading us into a paradigm shift, because as the guidance keeps coming out, as speculation keeps coming forward, we're aware of certain changes. What we aren't really aware of what those changes will be in the long term. We're a resilient industry. The desire for events is going to contribute to the recovery of this. What we're questioning is the new way of delivering going to change the old way, or is it going to just snap back to business as usual? You've got what will change, will configure change in stadia within auditoria, what will audiences expect, what will travel restrictions be, what will social distancing look like, you know, will we be wearing face masks? These are all questions that we're asking ourselves. What we are aware of, and it's very simple, is that COVID-19, a pandemic, is going to change how we work forever. We're all, you know, almost 1,000 people calling in today. We're all by and large operating out of home. Some of you may realise I'm not actually at the grounds right now. I'm in my home office. I'll be at the grounds later. We'll keep going. So in terms of the 5 cornerstones of how we deal with any playing or any event, contingency planning, and it's just been a must do for all planners, but COVID-19 is demanding us to recalibrate. Events of any scale, absolutely any scale, large or small, be it a small business style conference, an exhibition or otherwise, are now going to take the potential worst case scenarios. The unthinkable is to become a recurrent agenda item within that. Because of this, you're going to see, and as we're dealing with right now, contracts are going to be tightened, cancellation terms are going to carefully be reviewed. Venues and suppliers are going to try to protect themselves against losing revenue. Agencies are going to try to ensure that they can avoid paying out for events that never happened. And the focus on an event being cancelled will be just as much as an event being a success. Insurance. Now, many of the insurers have excluded communicable diseases historically during the previous outbreaks of SARS and avian flu. The event-specific policies that have included coronavirus are going to be very difficult to find, and if you do find them, they're going to be under very stringent control. So whilst you may find insurers offering communicable diseases as an optional extension, you're going to find by and large this won't include COVID-19. Contracts naturally are going to become closely considered with regards to liability and tort around this. what you have to think, and it's always an interest to me, is the insurance element really has driven home to the entire events industry the importance of insurance. Because this isn't really just about COVID, it's about, we know that the next disaster may be something entirely different. So insurance is really going to become a strong term in terms of not just taking it, but how it's going to determine our planning. The supply chain element, you know, we're all directly and indirectly reliant on other small businesses, freelancers working in events. So even with the government support, we are seeing companies struggling. Before any rebound within that, you are going to see supply chain difficulties. We are, and the quality of trade will vary, because already people will be taking jobs elsewhere to protect their income. So there's going to be some stabilization before we see any rebound. The market responds to community demand. I mean, it's an interesting one. It's difficult to understand how the market will react when the immediate threats are reduced. But there is an absolute appetite for events. I think what we're seeing in terms of planning is that as things relax, there'll be a flurry of activity coming from it, but our supply chains are stretched. Technology, so, you know, all of us have always been using technology to enhance an event, and any of us here who've gone to a major event or tournament will know what it's like being part of that visceral experience and how important that is to be around it. So, you know, virtual reality, behind closed doors, on broadcast, social media is not going to replace the very close and intimate nature of what being at events about. Until we're going to see this vaccination and treatment, really wet technology here is the mitigation technology. We're going to see temperature checks, crowd disinfection units, air purification units. This is going to be kind of more of the expected norm around what we're delivering. Naturally, track and trace app and mass community testing will further assist us operating under this shadow of COVID-19. Remote planning is already there. It's becoming the standard, and it's involving our new way of customer and etiquette. We're all in a remote environment right now. This is how we're doing this webinar. Practically, we're also looking at these remote systems, removing non-critical teams from site to work remotely to free up that space on site, which is going to be more important to us for welfare needs, clinical services. Now, not all of you will have medical teams working for your event, but if you're within a green guide, if you're within a sports event, you'll have doctors, paramedics operating within it. That service arrangement will change. We'll need more space within it. So these remote systems are going to become absolutely essential for the larger scale events. The health part of health and safety is absolutely within focus right now. And for many of us as practitioners, health has always been there, but it can be very safety orientated. Some of the new practices, some of the new will become norms, the new norms, but we aren't really fully aware of what the consequence of those are, what those impacts will be. IPC, which is infection prevention and control, may have always featured on the health and safety checklist, but practitioners are going to need a better CPD around this and not conflate what IPC is, not simplify it. It's going to become much more complex. It's really important to say that within that, we aren't working in biological containment labs. That isn't our industry. So for many of us, it is important, but we have to stop thinking that we are trying to stop, control, or the virus. Hygiene practices, cleaning practices, public health screening, staff surveillance, food safety practices are going to be expected to be within display. This is something that we're already doing through infographics, through our present business as usual model. You're going to hear, as we're all hearing now, more referencing in terms of biosecure environments, biocertification, and other kind markings coming out of this. But staff and customer assurance is going to be absolutely critical. Your event staff are going to want that assurance that they're coming into a safe environment, as your customers are as well. I'm confident that we can strike a balance of what the events are going to be, and we can actually be leaders within other business sectors looking at us. I'm trying to get this kind of analogy of working on a chalkboard, which I've sort of tenuously displayed within this presentation, but it's a conceptual space that we're working within right now. We shouldn't see this as a negative thing. We are risk managers. We manage risk. It's you know, a chalkboard is a place where we can redraw models, explore ideas, and see if the calculations are feasible. But what's really important is we're going to need to start sharing our chalkboards with each other, which we haven't necessarily as an industry been very good at doing. We're quite protective of our own product, but we're going to have to collaborate. Our individual success is based on our collective success. So we need to not just promote how something has become a success, we need to promote how, the very intricate nature of what made it a success, because our future is very much in each other.
Andrew,
That's me.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Andrew. So if you do have any questions for Andrew, please use the chat box. Thank you for that excellent start. I'm now going to turn to Nick Dugdale Moore, who is the Regional Manager at the Global Association of the Exhibition Industry. So welcome, Nick. If you could now share your screen with us.
Well, I'm going to set my timer first, Louise, to make sure I'm on time. And just to say, hi, everybody. Thank you to IOSH for inviting me here today. Just to introduce UFI briefly, we are the Global Association of the Exhibition Industry. We have just under 800 members in, I think, 87 countries around the world. 70% of them, a bit more, are international exhibition organizers. About 30% are venues. Some of them obviously overlap. And we have about 15%, which is either the national exhibition associations, like Chris from the AEO in the UK, or some of the supply chain. So really we represent the whole of the exhibition industry around the world. Now, this obviously is, you know, an unprecedented crisis we face. You know, back at our last meeting, which was in February in Rome, we had delegates with us from China, and we were discussing this, you know, and looking into China in the East and wondering if this would be similar to other epidemics in the East. Nobody could have predicted, you know, how big this would have become. And slowly, I guess the first large scale event was Mobile World Congress of an international stature that closed. And following that, you know, all events were closed globally. 3 billion people on lockdown, you know, a really unique crisis we are facing. So I'm just going to share my screen now and jump onto the UFI website to show you what we've been doing. So let me just move that out of the way. So this is the homepage of the UFI website, ufi.org. We set up a coronavirus page with various resources. So one of the first things I want to show you is we conducted an economic assessment, which showed, and this is only through to the end of the second quarter, so to the end of June, which showed that 81.6 billion euros of economic output would not be generated from lack of activity in the exhibition industry from the end of Q2. But arguably more importantly, at least 134 billion euros of contracts would not be concluded as a result of these events not taking place. So the conversation kind of changed for the first, obviously, you know, weeks, the month, people were bringing their workforces home and adjusting to the new reality. But in the event sector, within, let's say, a month, you know, the conversation turned to reopening again, and how do we reopen? And we were looking at various organizers, venues, and suppliers were starting to publish protocols or guidelines on how to safely reopen. And we looked at these, and 80 to 90% of it was the same. You know, it's mostly common sense. So we collected them together and we worked on this, which is the global framework for reopening exhibitions and B2B trade events post the emergence from COVID-19. Now, this was published in early May. We keep updating it as more and more companies endorse this. There's two parts to this framework. The first part is an advocacy narrative. So this is aimed at government and policymakers into why they should enable us to safely or confidently restart events. Now, firstly, you know, is to say that as event organizers, we're in the business of bringing people together, and safety is always paramount. You know, that unfortunately it's an unsafe world. There's always been challenges. There's always been incidents around the world, whether it's terrorist incidents or earthquakes. So, you know, our industry is used to dealing with risk, is used to putting people first, and that's a really important point to make. And also, furthermore, when there are crises, often our infrastructure and our venues are called upon to help with the recovery effort, such as Nightingale here in the UK. So the first part of this is to say that, you know, what I mentioned before, the economic impact of business events, of trade events, isn't just the heads and beds and the amount of money that the people spend in that given city. It's the underlying industry it represents. So whether it's a medical devices or a manufacturing or a leather show, you know, that industry not being able to meet is really important. And so now in the UK, looking at restarting, the quickest way, the fastest of fast tracks to economic recovery is to enable exhibitions to get meeting again. So we looked at, you know, one of the important distinctions, and one of the questions from, I think, Sarah in the Q&A said, you know, what's the difference between business events and other types of events? Now, in the WHO guidelines, we are classified as mass gatherings. Now, so this therefore classifies business events and exhibitions the same as beer festivals and pop concerts and festivals and sporting events. Now, clearly they are very different. You know, the way that we can manage the customer journey from before they leave the home, they can print their badges, you know, on site, it is a much more controlled way of organizing a meeting. And having 50,000 people, you know, in a venue for 2 or 3 hours is very different from a risk perspective than having them over 2 or 3 days. Secondarily, and here is the part of the framework, is the actual, you know, the framework itself. And predictably, well, I mean, reinforce personal and personal safety, enable physical distancing, increase health and safety, implement crowd control, and encourage and enforce measures. So here we are. I mean, we made it a framework and guidelines. We couldn't make it too specific, because ultimately then, you know, a policymaker could say, right, you have to enforce all of these, you know, to be able to get the go-ahead for your events. So this was the framework, and important to mention here the people that contributed to developing this. And you can see here a mix of exhibition organisers, organisers of venues, exhibition venues and associations, which is pretty globally representative. And then endorsement, you know, an even longer list of exhibition organisers, venues, again, the whole supply chain, and probably 3, 4, 5 companies every week are emailing us to say that they endorse this. So that was the framework that we published back in May. We then built on that with a good practice guide. So we joined forces with ICA, who you may know, who are the Global Association for the Conference and Congress Industry, and AIPC, which is the Venue Association. And this really built on the framework to give some more detailed examples of best practice in these various groups. So already we had some shows that are opening in China, in South Korea, in Asia, and we were able to build on you know, these best practice examples. So if you see here, you know, physical distancing, that was the first show, which was in Kintex, in the venue in South Korea. You can see there, you know, the various, whether it's a one-way visitor traffic flow, you know, how to arrange your various conference seating facilities. So again, this gives, you know, that's facial recognition, for example. You know, we can have contactless facial recognition. So all of these solutions already exist in the industry, you know, and people can pick and choose and use those. And we will continue adding to this as we go along, as more and more events open up. And I'm happy to say that, you know, in Germany, the first international show took place in Essen this week. And one important point to mention, I'm just going to jump over here, that back in at the beginning of May, Germany, who, as we know, do understand the value of exhibitions, they, back in May, prioritized exhibitions and gave them a special dispensation. They made the distinction between mass gatherings and exhibitions, which enabled the way for the individual states in Germany to decide the reopening date, which has been from June to September. And then finally, just to show, this was news from yesterday, so the Argentinian government has published protocols for reopening business events, and this was based on our reopening guide. And finally, I just want to show you one more thing, which may be of use to you. We launched a couple of weeks ago an exhibition market tracker, which is just a kind of really simple way of seeing which markets around the world are open with various restrictions. So looking at Europe, you can see, thankfully, quite a lot of green and orange, but unfortunately, the UK, you can see with Portugal and Belgium, we have no news whatsoever from our respective governments. So I'm going to leave it there. Happy to take any questions. I will post a link to the resources in the chat, and please get in contact with us. Happy to support you in any way.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's great to see that overview of the good practice guide, and you got full points for keeping to time. Thank you. So I'm going to now hand over to Simon Garrett. So Simon, if you could unmute yourself, show us your video and share your screen, please.
Yeah, just coming up and just starting my stopwatch. You'll be pleased to know. Right, okay. Okay, well, I'm picking up on a point I've seen from some of the comments, and I hear, festivals saying, well, what about us? But just a side comment before I start, that exhibitions are first up because we're lower footfall and lower risk, and if we can't get going, then no one is going to get going. So it's probably, bear with us if we talk about exhibitions, because that's what's happening at the moment. I'm going to talk about risk assessment. I've seen a lot of tools out there where it's more about assessing whether you should have the event in the first place, and that's not what this presentation is about. This presentation is about, you've decided to do the event is happening, so how should you approach the risk assessment? A normal event risk assessment, if I can put it in those terms, covers a range of different risks, whether it's crowd safety, security, logistics, lifting, food safety, fire safety, or all of those issues. We're only really, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, we're only dealing with one risk, which is the risk of transmission of the virus. And normally we look at the probability of something happening, the severity if it does, and then the risk rating to decide whether it's acceptable. And clearly the illustration there of something that is not acceptable. With the coronavirus, and these are UK numbers that I've or working on, but to be honest, you can translate them to wherever you are. But we have, the probability is the transmission rate, or the incident rate of a number of cases per 100,000 of population. So we know that going in. We know what the risk of encountering someone with the disease and the risk of that being passed on is. And in terms of severity, we already know that it can be symptomless, it can be life-changing, and sadly, in some cases, it can be fatal. And we've already lost 500,000 people worldwide to this horrible virus. So my suggestion is that right at the front of the risk assessment, you put some kind of positioning statement of risk that captures the key elements, so that we don't have to keep repeating it through the document and overcomplicating it. And I think Nick said it's mostly common sense, and I absolutely agree with him on this. So COVID-19 is a respiratory illness. We know that it is usually transmitted through sort of coughs and sneezes. It is possible for it to be transmitted through surface contact, but it's important to register that this isn't the main way that it is transmitted. And then if you actually read the detail on some of the papers, you'll see the risk of that is lower than the sort of airborne risk. It's not a foodborne virus. And again, I've seen a lot of very complicated documents on sort of food safety. If you were doing enough before the virus to make sure there were no harmful, pathogens in the food, then that should still be enough. The issue with the catering side is social distancing in the catering setup. It isn't the food itself. And as we know, the infection can lead to serious illness, even death. Not usually serious of those of working age, and that is something that we can factor in. And it's more likely to develop in those with serious health conditions, immune deficiencies, diabetes, that sort of thing. So again, some kind of statement to that effect at the beginning of the risk assessment does set the template. And I think it is also important to put at the beginning what the planning assumptions are. And again, we come back to the fact that events are only going to happen if the government allows them to happen. And that will only happen if the risk has reduced to a level that permits these sort of business activities. So we're not trying to remove all risk from the environment. We're just trying to ensure that we're not doing things, not exposing to people to more risk than they would otherwise be exposed outside the event. In terms of social distancing, one of the things you do need to do, and we do this anyway for fire safety, is work out whether you actually have the physical distance or physical space to host the numbers of people. Of course, it's theoretical, but or in a sense, because not everyone is going to be equally spaced. But if you know, for example, that you've got 20,000 square meters of net space, i.e. places for people to stand, and that the maximum number of visitors you've got is 5,000 visitors, then you've got, in theory, 4 square meters available per person. And if you do that calculation, you know you at least got the space that you need to create the social distancing that you need. The numbers will, of course, differ from event to event, and you know, if you're using 1 meter as the social distancing, then 4 meters, square meters, would be comfortable. The next thing to do is to have a lot of you will recognize this as a sort of a risk assessment template. But if you stated all that I've previously covered up front, then all you need to do is think about when and where this contact may take place, who would be at risk, and what are the controls in those areas. And I do think, you know, in the template that I've done here, it's probably a good idea to put in what the organizer controls are, and then the venue controls, and maybe a note of some advisory controls, which are the nice to haves, but the things that you're not necessarily going to enforce. So where would those key areas be? I think it's important to mention the event office, and this isn't something that would normally get a lot of attention, but it's worth considering that if you're an event team and one person becomes infected, then you possibly lose the entire team, not to infection, but to track and trace protocols that require them all to then self-quarantine. So that probably needs quite a lot of thought. Don't forget the construction phases. I've seen a lot of event risk assessments for this to just completely forget about the construction side of it. You can't foot a ladder at 2 meter social distancing. So again, you need to think that side through. Obviously, live face arrivals and reception is where there's going to be a bunching together. The live phase general access, catering and hospitality. Don't forget after show events as well. That is a lot of the time, that's what attracts people to events. It's the other events that surround it. Again, everyone will have their own list, but that's probably a good start point. There are numerous industry templates out there. Don't worry about the details on what is there. It's just a grab of the one we have. I know Andrew said everyone's been very protective. I recognize what he's saying, but I'm very happy to send this template and the comment sheet that we got to anyone that would like it. I'm happy to share it. I do think it's important though to put this in context. An event risk assessment is all about context. No event was ever or will ever be risk-free. I see phrases like COVID safe and bandied around. I think we need to be quite careful there, because we can't be saying that it is totally risk-free, but that's not necessarily what we're aiming for. These are UK numbers, but we have 6.7 cases per 100,000. That's 1 in 15,000 people. So you're not necessarily likely to encounter or someone in your everyday life that does actually have the infection. And we can assume that that will come down before exhibitions are allowed. The R rate of less than 1 means that an infected person only infects one other person, and not necessarily on the day that they visit the event. And it is reasonable to assume, I think, that those who are especially vulnerable will stay away from crowded public spaces, which does reduce the risk. To put it into context, and there's not a direct comparison, but a UK citizen has a 1 in 3,000 chance of being hospitalised with food poisoning in any given year. So I think that's worth thinking about. And just to sort of, by a concluding summary, it is important. So I've said, don't get it out of proportion, but it is important. It needs to be taken seriously. The risk of transmission and the effects are already known quantities, so we only need to focus on the points and time of transmission. Consider the risk that you might lose your entire event team through quarantine procedure if one member displays symptoms. The risk assessment does not need to be complicated, and my template isn't. and please keep a sense of proportion. And I think that's my website if anyone wants to contact me for the template. And that concludes, Louise, my presentation.
Thank you.
In under 10 minutes, you'll be pleased.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, guys. If you could carry on adding your questions to the Q&A box, we will pose those later. So, Simon, if you could turn off your video and stop sharing your screen now. If all of the slides and the presentations will be available for feedback. So I know that those have been some of the questions. Now I'm going to introduce Chris Skeeth next. So Chris, if you could make yourself available, so that's great. So welcome, Chris. So we're going to do things a bit differently between myself and Chris. I'm going to pose you some questions, which means that I've got to keep time. So welcome to the webinar. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about Project Confidence, Chris?
Of course, thank you. It's always a pleasure to come and last onto a webinar, because often many of the things you wanted to say have already been covered and the rest of the panelists have covered quite a lot of things really well. Just to give a little framework before I talk about Project Confidence, just to give you an idea of the size of the market, in the UK, the AEA represents 86 organisers of events, primarily exhibitions. There are over 1,100 of those happening in the UK each year, generating some £11 billion worth of economic value, not including the business that's generated at the events. So the stopping through COVID is going to cost the UK economy some £8 billion. There's some 55,000 people involved in the direct running of exhibitions through our economic impact study, and overall 114,000 people, and we're estimating job losses of some 50% of those, so it's quite a big and important sector. In terms of international activity, the UK is home to the largest group of independent organisers in the world. They do over 1,000 events around the world and bring over £2 billion worth of economic turnover into the UK economy. So the UK certainly leads the way, and obviously that presents some challenges when you're looking at trying to apply UK regulations and UK processes when you operate internationally. So there's very much a case of what happens here tends to have to be replicated throughout the world due to the regulatory framework of those businesses. The other side with BVEP, and this is where it gets a little bit challenging. Somebody said what the industry needs is another association. There are about 30 trade associations in the event space, ranging from festivals to outdoor, to meetings, to conferences, and the BVEP estimates there's about £70 billion economic impact for all those event types. And here lies in a little bit of the problem, and how we can build some of the confidence is that an outdoor festival, a gig, a rave is very, very different to a business event where you have a controlled environment. So whilst we've been able through BVEP to present an overall case of the impact of COVID on the event sector, it's been interesting that a number of people have had to take their separate view within their separate sectors. So of the 70 billion, we're about 11 billion. So a little bit of a framework. The event space is very complicated. So your members will be looking at lots of different sets of guidelines and lots of different sets of information, and the devil is very much in the detail, as each event is very, very different. So I'm afraid accessing resources and looking at things is going to be pretty important. So that's a little bit of a scene set. In terms of Project Confidence, we took a three-step approach to COVID. The first step was to push for recognition from government as to the value and volume of the sector, and make sure that they understood the impact on jobs, the impact on the economy, but also the impact on the industries that the events serve. Just to give you one idea, the Southampton Boat Show was cancelled on Friday last week because the government couldn't issue a licence. One of those exhibitors, that event alone, last year over the 10 days of the event accounted for 15% of their turnover. And as a result of the boat show not happening, they're going to be making 20% of their workforce redundant, which is quite a harrowing tale. And the event was worth £24 billion to the Southampton economy. So these are big numbers and big impacts that have been in place. So having those information to share the stories of the impacts with government's been really key. So raising awareness within government about the value and volume of the sector is one. The second is creating the guidance. So we've contributed to the stuff that UFI created, but also we've taken a global open source document called All Secure and adapted that within the UK. I would love to be able to do a screen share and show you that today. However, that is sitting with the Cabinet Office, has been sat there for almost a month. And we're on draft 10. So I lovingly refer to the current version as draft 10 at number 10. It's been through Public Health England, it's been through the HSE, it's been through lots of elements, but give you a little bit of a snapshot of what it looks like is very much as Simon was talking about. It's a risk assessed approach. It has 4 cornerstones, looking at physical distancing, looking at cleaning and hygiene, looking at protect and detect, and then the final area, the communications. But it is a real risk assessed process. So what we found at the beginning is everybody's getting paranoid about 2 meters, looking at 4 meter aisles, looking at how they could fit everything in, and rushing around about how they could actually fit everything in. And I said, you need to look about how you can manage physical distancing rather than what does 2 meter mean. We lobbied hard, UK government, we had the change to be 1 meter plus. And that's obviously meant that there's a lot more flexibility in there and viability within there. So the document doesn't dictate numbers, it doesn't dictate any sort of capacity sides of things. It looks very much at a risk assessed approach, which is something that Simon and the X-Venture team have been practicing and preaching for many years. And as an industry, we live by things. So the guidance is very much along those lines, but it is supported by other things like key measures. So we've had the venues and the organisers as well as the suppliers all involved in hundreds of hours of meetings to come up with some key measures in terms of the kind of things you could do to manage those risks that you've assessed, and also create, I don't know if you're aware of the e-guide. It's a guide that's been written for the exhibition centres by the exhibition centres, and it details the application of rules and regulations and other regulatory areas and how they can consistently apply those across the venues to make it easier for customers to interact. So there's going to be an addendum to the e-guide. As I said, I'd love to share it. However, if we share it with you, the government won't endorse it. So we can't share it with you, but the government haven't endorsed it yet, so it's all a little bit
so we'll look forward to receiving that. So Chris, we know that we have a lot of international people on the call today. Yes. And countries around the world have introduced quarantine measures to control the risks of transmission of the virus, and in some countries these have been lifted. How can organisers of international events overcome these challenges of quarantine?
And do you mean events in the UK that are international?
Yeah.
Events around the world.
Yeah.
So obviously, I mean, keeping a watching brief, building customer confidence in the events is key, and ultimately you're going to be dictated to by the guidance that's issued by various different governments. So it's probably looping back to the guidance. So if you think about business events, you look at trade and consumer shows. For all of those events, we hold GDPR compliant data. We know who's coming. We can ask them to come at a particular time. We can then do track and trace. And over and above that, we could also do localized lockdown. So unfortunately, if you're running an event tomorrow and you had a big audience coming from Leicester, for example, you could actually say, actually, I'm really sorry, due to the lockdown in the area, you're not permitted to come to the event. So one thing I don't think the government has realised is the amount of control, not only in the audience that comes, whether that be international or domestic, we know who the people are who are coming to the events, but also in the environments that we create. So we're able to create traffic flows and all the rest of it just to make sure that people don't come up in pockets. Unlike Soho, the weekend, there's a very real ability to control the environments that we look at. So for quarantine, unfortunately, it's completely out of the events industry hands. You're dictated to by whatever government is saying. We are representing the case that there are a number of events in the UK that are international. They are international because the UK is a destination of choice. They are here because the infrastructure is strong. But our European counterparts, as Nick alluded to earlier on, they're open for business, and it's a hard justification to a board to say, I think we should keep it at in a venue in the UK when you have European venues open and trying to win that business to come to you. So they are at huge risk, and these are very, very strong messages we're pressing to government that our international competitiveness is severely at risk by not allowing those international events to happen, to let those international visitors come in.
And in terms of, I mean, you are working very closely with the government, and we know that health is an evolved issue. So we've got potentially different standards in Scotland, England and Wales, just in the UK. So what challenges has that posed you?
Well, very fortunately, last week Scotland issued their guidance, which is great. That guidance then jumped straight back to the UK Gov website. And for those who are interested, section 2.2.3 of the guidance on COVID refers to business events, and that actually loops straight back to the guidance that we are waiting to be created. So I think the guidance has been through so many iterations involving all the devolved nations and also all the government departments. It's a less of an area of contention. The go date they will ultimately decide, but in terms of the actual guidance, because it is a risk assessed approach, that's probably one of the easier battles to win. The biggest battle we've had to win, as you rightly say, is the public health aspect and drawing comparisons about our ability to know our audiences. And believe me, it is really, really difficult to explain to a member who is in severe financial crisis that how come you can have hundreds and thousands of people in a particular area as long as they don't talk to each other because they're not from the same family group, versus having a controlled audience of people that you know who they are, when they come, how long they've been there, with the ability to track and trace, etc. So we've been pushing those messages strongly, and I actually missed the briefing call for this webinar because I was on the phone to the government providing yet more information and evidence to hopefully convince them that they should let events open and run with a good lead time, because it takes a while to reignite those particular events. The other thing that I think is quite important is also the confidence side. People have got out of the habit of going to the office, and many are working at home. But what we're finding increasingly is businesses are desperate to meet. So I think it was on the pre-chat before this call about, can't wait to get back to the office to meet people and go and see things. So businesses are desperate to trade. Autumn Fair, the largest retail event in Birmingham in the UK, that was cancelled last week, and those buyers, those suppliers, that sourcing of stock for the Christmas shopping period of retail outlets is going to be severely diminished as well by those events. So people are pleading to get events back up and running. Just need to convince the government to let us start helping the economic recovery.
That's fantastic. Well, we have that. The time goes quick, doesn't it, Chris?
It doesn't matter too much, I'm sorry.
So what we're going to do now is, if I can ask all of our panelists to open up your videos, we're going to take some questions from the floor that have come up. I'm actually going to start with, hopefully, if you could all turn your videos back on, we'll bring everybody back online, and keep those questions coming in. So I was going to start with a question for Andrew, actually, if you're still there. Yeah, Andrew's still there. Hi. If you could unmute. Andrew, I'm going to ask you a question about insurance. So we've had a few questions about insurance and insurance cover, and I'm just interested to get your experiences from Wimbledon.
So it's it's eating away at a large part of my time. We, as you'd know, we had a pandemic insurance policy, but for anyone who's ever even put in a small insurance claim, it's a long process, and that in itself, it doesn't just happen instantaneously, and we everything is audited through it. So irrespective of what we had, what the industry is responding is, some of the questions that are being asked about insurance I've been trying to answer. You're already seeing cancellation terms changing within your contractual documents. Everyone is trying to protect their own losses, and it's a fraught situation. It's a difficult situation. it's, I mean, we have our head of legal dealing with the contract law aspect is busier because of this. So the cause and effect of what simply having a tiny little change within the contract can be enormous, particularly as your event is bigger and you've got broadcast and you've got licensing rights and everything else tied into it. The reality is that, you know, in terms of the insurance market hedging, that this is something that you're just not going to find in insurance policies. You'll find that there'll be communicable disease down there. You're just not going to find it as COVID-19. And if you do find it's COVID-19, like I said, it's going to be so expensive and so stringent in terms of the terms of having it, that it's just not viable as an extension. And that puts us all in the realms of what we need. It goes back to that kind of mitigation of how we have X number of people in a space, how we not, and I use the word control, how we educate the behaviour of them, and how we can become leaders within that. And equally the technology, you know, yes.
So yeah, no, because I think we
sorry
were
as I go off, but it's
we
very,
were discussing on the call that you actually had some cover, and probably one of the few organisations that did. So Nick, I'm going to come to you next. So you know, some of the conversations that we've been having is that your sector is you know, to a certain extent, a bit more controlled. We've had quite a few questions about temperatures and temperature checking. And you know, whole body scanning, this kind of thing. So I don't know if you've got any comments to make on that.
Well, I mean, at the perimeter, the temperature checks, which you now see, I mean, if you've traveled in Asia, you see them at almost every airport or kind of large, you know, large building that you go in. So, and I think they have started, or they did start to do it at Heathrow and places. So somebody asked, you know, if this needs a qualified medic. As far as I understand, no, you don't. You know, this is not a kind of highly skilled job. You know, and these are the sort of, we were talking yesterday in our briefing call, you know, what will be, you know, post this, what will, you know, we're never going to go back. But, you know, nowadays you see, you know, these sort of measures at large events, it's mostly confidence and reassuring for the public. I mean, obviously, you know, it's a very, it's one of the tools that you can use, but yeah, that I'm sure that temperature checks will be with us, you know, from now on. That's a thing that we'll live with.
And realistically, you know, in the UK, you know, none of us have a crystal ball, but you know, is the industry sort of getting geared up to move forward? You know, how do you see us?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's more a question for Chris.
Yeah, Chris, I'll bring you in then at that point, Chris.
So what's really funny is everybody's running away with the control measures at the start rather than asking what the question was. So some venues have invested significant sums in certain temperature control, infrared, all those sort of things. And then there was a huge discussion about what is the temperature. I think 38.6 springs to mind, I think. I can't remember exactly, I can check. But that sort of temperature will be cited. But then you've got all the ongoing problems about what do you do if somebody presents? What happens if they cycle there? Goodness me, with our new health kick of getting there, where do you put them? There's a bit of an outcast until they've had their temperature check. So it is mixed, but ultimately it's about the value proposition that the venue decides to offer. So with the NEC, for example, they put in security archers permanently after the awful effects of the tragedies we saw in the arenas market a year or so ago. So as it happens, they are planning to invest, as far as I'm aware, in some infrastructure, because that's going to be part of their USP, a bit like other venues like the Business Design Centre. They invest in super fast broadband and make that free to everybody. So it's going to be part of the venue's DNA. Another venue, probably prefer not to say the name, but they're going to issue all organisers handheld temperature scanners that they bought a while ago. But what was fascinating in the journey with government through our wonderfully exciting and inspiring drafts of the guidance is that they wanted to pull everything back to what Public Health England says. So that's the indicator.
So actually that kind of ties in with one of the questions that I've got, which is great, from Alison Green. She says, you mentioned you're on draft number 10, waiting for number 10. Have you been given any indications as to quite how many drafts might be required, or is a crystal ball needed for that question?
I think in addition to a crystal ball, copious amounts of gin and tonic. So I was liaising on a number of things with DCMS colleagues last night. I've been up since 5 a.m. this morning, making sure there are no further questions coming back from the Cabinet Office on that. I was with the Business Secretary yesterday. So we are, well, we can do no more, and I think Boris is on at 5 today, so we'll find out if the work has happened. So there's an expected announcement at 5 o'clock. Don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath. It could be another damp squid. So I'm just about to go to the supermarket to make sure I've got plenty of gin. However, the changes from the open source All Secure were more making them relevant to UK. So we referred to, if people felt the need, they could have PPE, and then they went, ooh, you can't do that. Our government advice is that you wear face coverings on public transport, and that's it. So it was aligning it with government practice, which is a bit frustrating because it's about a risk assessed approach, and we may feel that we want to.
We understand that as professionals, don't we? So it's
just a complete set of people who are trying to do the right thing. I promise not to swear on this webinar, so I'm not going to. But they seem to understand. So for that question, I generally don't know, but we were up to the 13th of June. We were on 10 iterations. I feel it's about there now. Now it's about how can we grab Chris Whitty and take him somewhere that can demonstrate what the environment looks like. It's generally at those levels of conversation, and Sage. Yeah, we are pulling along, and any more I will probably lose even more hair. Is it possible for a beard to fall out as well as my hair? I don't know, but we will get there.
Simon, I'm going to go over to you now. So Simon, you are Vice Chair of the IOSH Group, Sports Group and Events Group, which, you know, the groups within IOSH are very important for thought leadership, and, you know, you've been pulling a lot of this information together for our members. What more can our members expect from your group, and how are you supporting the events industry at this time?
Well, quite a lot of it is not visible, though I hope this webinar has actually made visual a lot of the work's going. So obviously I'm directly involved, and other members of the committees with me are directly involved in all of the projects that have been mentioned. We do also have a microsite, so a lot of the content, so a lot of the stuff about risk assessment and things we've actually put on the microsite. We are also available. We do a lot of work, not necessarily directly with individual members, but with the organisations, some of which are sitting here. So directly with the AAO, with JACE, which has the link to the HSE, DCM. We have a rep from the SGSA, Sports Grounds group on our committee. So we link to a lot of these groups and then feed in using our own expertise, or indeed reaching out to those that we know in the community to say, okay, we've got this issue, can you help us advise AO or AV or any of the other organisations? We're happy to do more.
Really linking it all in, so if anybody's, you know, in the events industry, it's a key place to go and have a look.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, if you want us to do more, let us know.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just gonna go around the panel again very, very quickly. If you could give me literally a couple of sentences on the positives that you've brought out of this, how, you know, you've experienced new things, what's the good stuff that's come out of this? Just a couple of sentences. So Andrew, I'm going to go to you first.
A couple of sentences. I think this webinar has really done it. This is, we as an industry are communicating more with each other about how we're going to do this and how we're going to get an event run than we ever have before. So, I mean, many of the people I'm with today, I've known you through LinkedIn, through the work you've done before, but this is, we are all now communicating, sharing ideas about how this goes forward, and that's a really, really good positive thing.
Nick, your last thoughts, positives?
I want to start by saying there's an old Sufi poet, one of the medieval Iranian poets, who had there's a legend that said that there was a king that had a golden ring, and he wanted an inscription on the ring that would last throughout the ages, that would be true forever. And they asked the sage the dervish, and he said, "This too shall pass." So, you know, this will pass. We feel like, you know, we're in the darkest of times now, especially here in the UK. But fundamentally, human beings, we have a need, a want to come together and to meet. So I think events, you know, all types of events, you know, we'll get through this, and there will always be a need and a want to meet together. No matter how virtual the world goes, I think that will put a more of a premium and a value on real face-to-face events.
Absolutely. And Simon?
Yeah, well, I've got but the background behind me is to hide the fact that I am actually at an event venue, and they didn't want to advertise, or I didn't want to, you know, complicate things. But you know, we are discussing an event that will be open next month. It is an exhibition, and I have a number of clients that we're ready to go. We have the plan. We've done the risk assessment. We have the plan, and my God, is it G'd up. The professional, I think a lot of people have stepped up to the plate, and I think that comment's already been made, and it's good to see organisations like UFI and really step up and start engaging. And I think whatever the next issue is round the corner, the government better be on notice, certainly in the UK, that it's going to get some serious lobbying, because we know how to do this now, I think. Maybe I didn't want to steal Chris's thunder. But.
And Chris, you've got to have you know, before you go back to number 10, your sort of final, you know, the good stuff that's come out of all of this for you.
Okay, 3 things from me. I think the government does get the value of the sector. We've always been a bit of a sleeping giant in the corner that nobody's got, and actually the ability to cut through and have a one-to-one with Nadeem Zahawi and get him asking you questions is really cool. Speaking to Rishi and all that is, so I think that's amazing. We've never had that audience before. Collaboration, I think, within and across the industry around the world, and also with particularly in the UK, that we're having, you know, those sort of barriers are breaking down about people, you know, treading on each other. So we all have a common purpose. Therefore, we all have one purpose to get events going again. So all that legacy stuff disappeared. And the third thing is always a worry to say the third thing and then forget what it was that you were actually going to say, which I've just managed to do. That's terrible. I've forgotten to say that. I think the third thing, that has absolutely gone out of my head. So it was collaboration, it was government, and maybe it's the need for more alcohol, because it is one. That's probably what it is. So yeah, we miss all that. But now I can't remember the third thing, but it doesn't really matter. So, but thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing our bit of a story. And I'm very, very sorry I've not been able to do a screen share just yet, but hopefully we'll be able to do that and get the UK going again very soon.
Well, that just leaves me to say a very big thank you to all of our speakers and panelists today. Thank you to you out there listening, and thank you for all the work that you're doing at the moment as well, because I know that everybody is working extremely hard right now. You will see a poll just coming up in your window if you could complete that. Thank you for participating. I'm sorry if we didn't quite make it to your questions at this time, but we've had well over 600 people on the call today, almost 700 people. Everything will be available to download on the IOSH website. Keep an eye on the Covid-19 webinars page and other IOSH channels, and just stay connected with all of us. I think it's, you know, all of these sessions are breaking down silos every week. So thank you all. Please do take care, stay healthy, and tune in for the next webinar next week. Thank you and goodbye.